Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Smith. I'm Group Managing Director of People to People in Australia and Frog Recruitment in New Zealand. Happy New Year. It's 2021 and we made it. We actually made it. And we're here once again with the People to People Leadership Webinar series. And we have a great session today on how to develop a growth mindset. And I'm particularly delighted to introduce our guest today. Frances Valentine is a leader in innovation and emerging technologies. After a 20 years career in higher education and creative technology, Frances launched Tech Futures Lab in 2016. Committed to the development of people and capability and developing a culture of innovation and responsiveness to technological advancement. Frances has worked with over 250 organisations from every sector in New Zealand, from agriculture to finance, retail to law, and has gained a reputation as an expert in leading change initiatives. She even mentioned to me before coming online today that she had a very close encounter with the PM in New Zealand today, so which I think is fantastic. In 2018, in the 2018, New Year's Honours, Frances was appointed a Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit, recognising her lifetime contribution in education and technology. In 2017, Frances received the New Zealand Flying Kiwi Award, inducted into the New Zealand High Tech Hall of Fame, and also named one of New Zealand's top 3 NZ innovators. Frances connected with the New Zealand Frog recruitment team and luckily has been coerced by Remy, our marketing manager, to join us today. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Frances and keen to hear how to build a growth mindset, create a learning culture, and to seek her wisdom on where to next. Please welcome Frances Valentine.
Thank you, Mark. It is such a delight to be here. We're back in lockdown here in Auckland at the moment, so I'm joining you from home, and it's just great to be connected in this way.
No, it's fabulous. Thanks for joining us. Keen to hear what you have to say, but I'll pass it over to you.
Right, well, I'm going to actually do a presentation as I go through, just for those who like pictures as the words flow. So let me just very quickly share my screen, and then we will... Just a moment. The technology run. Now I'm hoping you can see that. Is there a way of letting someone know that they can see that or not?
Yes, we can see.
Thank you so much, really appreciate it. I'm in full screen mode, so I can't see you. So thank you.
All good. Sorry about that.
Okay, look, I just want to start off with this whole concept of growth mindset and learning. The two things go hand in hand. And actually, as mature adults, we often find that we have put the idea of learning into the front part of our lives, or sort of preloading, so to speak. And we sort of imagine in the first, say 22 years of our lives that perhaps we've learned enough to carry us through into our careers. And actually what we're finding right now with such rapid change in the world is we've never had such an onus on professionals and working adults to upskill and actually invest in their own future. And so I want to start by taking you on a small journey. And I think context is everything when you're trying to think about growth and learning and development. And one of the things that has become very paramount in the last 12 months for all of us is that this little planet of ours bouncing around the solar system is very much interconnected. And actually what happens in one part of the world also affects other markets, the way we trade, the way we communicate, the way we educate, the way we even provide health solutions, as we're seeing with the vaccines. It all comes down to this one planet. And so I always find when a day is getting tough and I'm thinking about, I've got so much going on and where do I, how do I find more time? I think about this idea that we're not here for that long. And so we might as well make the most of it. So to set the scene, a little unusually, I'm going to take you on a journey of space. Now, the Hubble Space Telescope, I'm sure all of you have heard of, they're now capturing further and further into space. And this one little video, I want to take you on the journey about perhaps how far we've already traveled in space with the help of a telescope. So there is no audio or any commentary. I just want you to sit back and just think about this for a couple of minutes while we go into this session. Now, watching that, you may have wondered first up, why are we watching this? But on the other hand, if you think about the idea that actually we are in a time right now where we can actually, just over a week ago, we landed a mission onto Mars, and we've now been able to map it out. Of course, we haven't got humans there yet, but there is already talk about colonizing Mars into the future. But the idea is that the troubles that we have today can feel very minimal if you think about how vast this universe is and what we can achieve. And so I want to start with a New Zealand context, and I know Australia will be very similar to this. If you were born in 1870, you would have had a very low life expectancy of somewhere around 34 years. And actually, over the decades, we are becoming better and better at understanding how our bodies are best looked after. And we're getting to the stage now where even getting into the 80s is probably going to be seen as a very low number in another 10 years. And more of us will expect to live beyond 100. And that does mean that the way we think about a growth mindset across different decades and different generations is going to have to change, because actually we're going to be working for much longer and working with a much greater generational gaps between. So already there are 5 generations in the workforce, the largest ever, and potentially we'll go into a 6th generation or even a 7th-generation workforce as we start thinking about retirement perhaps more towards the 80s and maybe even 90s in the future. And so this idea that we think that most of the learning should happen early should be replaced with this idea of sabbaticals, almost sort of throughout your career, and actually taking the step out to be able to advance your career on. So in the work that I do, I fundamentally focus on the future scenarios and looking at the levers of change and what is happening in the world that can be evidenced right now, what is potentially possible, and then going into futures, which are some of the things which you can extrapolate from today's world and imagine in a few years. Now, of course, the last year has changed things even faster. Depending on which surveys you look at, basically the world has advanced somewhere between 5 and 8 years digitally in the last year. So over a period of the first 6 weeks of lockdown, we saw massive digital transformation happening across the world. And for, of course, many countries not as fortunate as Australia and New Zealand, they've actually found themselves in a position where they have really had to go and think about distribution and channels to market and the way they brand and sell their product very differently. So there is not one area that has changed. So we have to think about the intersectionality between different sectors. So if you work in finance, it's often you'll live in the world of finance, the people around you on a daily basis will be also in the financial sector or fintech, and it's actually quite hard to know sometimes what may be happening politically or culturally unless you are a curious person. And so what we need to be thinking about if we map our world is, what do we really know about these different areas? How much do we understand about the financial markets and what is happening and going on? And of course, a lot of it right now is very volatile, and you know, lots of things that are appearing in the financial markets have never been seen before. We're certainly seeing massive shifts in economic behavior. There is a real move towards things like donut economics and thinking more about people at the heart of the economy and moving away from the standard economic measures. The technologies, which I'll talk about more in detail, but the technologies of our time are really absolutely life-changing, business-changing technologies. For some of you will be already on the journey of understanding the impact and benefits of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and many of you will be using sensors and the Internet of Things, but actually just around the corner there are a number of other advances that are happening that will actually impact our business and our competitiveness in the marketplace. The political environment has changed, it continues to change, and we are seeing a very much an uprising of young people who are the dominant generations in the marketplace. So both in Australia and in New Zealand, the #1 demographic in the workplace right now are millennials. So they sit at about 52% of our workforces. Both countries are the same. And actually what that means is we have a generation now who are thinking quite differently. They're much more digitally savvy, but right behind them is really the big generation, Generation Z, who have come out of university, entering into the workforce, and they have never known the world without the internet. And depending on which end of the Generation Z they are, the more digital they are, the younger they are. And they're coming through and completely changing things, and that's changing politics as we imagine it, because they're connected and have a voice they've never had before. The cultural shifts that are happening, we've seen that from everything from the rise of Indigenous thinking through to Black Lives Matter, through to the power of diversity. And so that's going to be a strong theme going through. the ecological, the environmental, the climate change issues that we're all going to face have come onto all of our board agendas. And then the sociological. Humanity is responding to change differently. We're responding to the situation of crisis differently, and we've got a lot going on ahead of us. So just let's take a little recap across the last 12 months. And I appreciate a lot of these are not familiar to us because we haven't had the same impact. But actually what happens with this interconnected ecosystem that we have across the world is what does happen in one place becomes norm. So if you take the Catholic priest in the bottom left-hand corner who's having his sermon via YouTube or via a live streaming service, now we're starting to see people who are connecting back into churches in this way and actually may not see the need to go back to a physical building. We've seen isolation and ways that people have had to think about quarantining. We've seen a whole lot of people learning online and parents becoming teachers. We've seen empty stadiums or completely stadiums full with fake crowds. And we've all got very good at the social distancing. Doesn't matter really where you are. Some of the other markets around the world are very much the same. This was a pandemic that affected us all, and we've had to live with these new norms. But as you think of these new norms, if you look at that image in the bottom left-hand corner, when you've got a sports stadium that would normally be packed with tens of thousands of people, suddenly empty, now what does that real estate look like into the future? What will it mean when people are wary of actually large crowds? And actually, when we start seeing things like esports growing faster and having bigger crowds online and watching these events, you start to see that there's a shift in the way we're thinking. We're starting to also think about coming out of COVID, and I think it's really important we start focusing on the future. We're seeing vaccinations come into our markets. We're starting to see frontline workers be vaccinated. Now is our time to imagine what we're going to look like in both countries in terms of what we'll be known for, what will Australasia be seen as we go into 2021 and beyond. So I want to stop here for a moment and just talk about these three images, three very different times. The first one taken in the industrial age, where people gathered together of the same skill set. Often they had hard manual labor, things that are done today by machines. And so the gathering of the workplace was designed to be at a time that suited most people. So the 9 to 5 working day was formed. And it meant that people could go to work, their children could go to school. And in this particular era, it's probably most likely that the wives would be at home tending to the house. As we move forward and look at the bottom left corner, it's just something more indicative of recent times, where pre-COVID, it became quite acceptable to have lots of people in cubicles and large spaces sitting next to each other, having almost no interaction on a digital device. And actually, this was a knowledge economy. But what COVID has taught us, as per the right-hand image, is actually that job can be done anywhere. And actually, there is no need to travel across the city. There is no need to be sitting in a room full of people where you're not connecting and communicating, when you can be in the comfort of your home or with friends and family around. And while it's not for everyone, what we do know is this is rewiring expectations about staff, and actually they're going to be thinking in a very different way. So if you are a business leader, if you're an employer, you need to be thinking about your growth mindset, about how you feel about a workforce that are going to be demanding different types of work and working environments. So let's just think about that for a little bit. So this distributed workforce has now obviously meant that people expect to be the ability to be able to work from home. And it means that they could also work for international companies from wherever they are. And so that could equally be that you're hiring someone in the US working in Australia for an Australian company, or it could be somebody who is outsourced doing dev work for you from India, and you're working different time zones. You're thinking about where people might live, and you'll probably have staff already who are asking to work from their holiday homes, or thinking about moving a bit more into the regions where accommodation, housing, for example, is a little less expensive. So I want to just really highlight a few key areas here. So the first one is we have to understand that societal polarization for people who do need to front up in the office every day, or do need to be in the retail store if they're not e-commerce, or they need to be working in health, for example. And so we also have to think about the mental health of actually what it means to work alone. And if you live alone, work alone, and actually you're spending all day in front of a computer, there is all sorts of impacts we have to be responsible for, and thinking about how do we address things that could come from this, the loss of social capital, and actually things like interpersonal skills if people spend so much time isolated. So what will that pan out? What's the balance between these two worlds? The other focus we need to be thinking about is emerging in virtual collaboration spaces and thinking about how can we make these environments more interesting and more innovative, and actually be thinking about what will applicants want from you as an employer. You know, what are the things that are going to make your job so much more interesting? And so all these areas are part of this future going forward. And actually, there isn't a time in the future where we're going to go back to a 9-to-5 job, unless you literally are in a very traditional business model and that actually works for you. You may find, for example, if you're in a small regional town with a retail store, that may work for you for a while. It may work for you for a little longer than the cities, but over time, we are going to become more distributed, more connected online, and we're going to rely a lot more on digital channels. And that even goes as far as things like looking at artificial intelligence, that they may be better at determining, an algorithm may be better to determine the suitability of an applicant for the type and environment of work than deciding on those skill sets that someone brings into a normal, typical job interview. Just as an indication of how widespread this is, so across the world, there's a number of large, high-profile companies. They're all in different markets. But actually, if you start to think, like companies like Amazon have got 92,000 staff working from home until June this year, where they're going to reevaluate. American Express, the same time frame. But actually, a lot of them have got no intention to come back into any form of physical space, or at least not making it compulsory. A lot of these buildings and companies are disappearing. They're letting go leases. Some have bought out leases at the sum of many millions of dollars for the fear of having empty spaces that will no longer be needed. And so if you start to think about the number of millions and millions of people around the world right now who are working in this either mode of in between, in the work environment or the home environment, in between this idea where they can work from in sort of collective spaces and shared office spaces, or they could be working from their holiday home. Actually, it's going to be a really hard push to imagine going back to anything that resembles a sort of a fixed contract or a fixed expectations around hours. And so again, if you're thinking about this growth mindset, it's like, how do you build that into your thinking when actually your staff are going to be requiring it? There are many different occupations that are going to change over this time, and I think it's important to understand there is a difference country to country. Where there's large populations like in China and India, there is expectation there's still some growth in some more traditional areas, such, for example, as food services. They still imagine an increase in people doing these roles, where those same roles in food services in the US, for example, or places like Japan, with a very much an aging population, we're seeing rapid decrease and a fast automation. And so there is a big sort of shift between those who are going to be shifting in their employments, the way they're thinking about it, and those who are going to be really thinking about automation, digitization. A great example is the growth in e-commerce over the last year, and actually it is significant. So it's grown, e-commerce is 2 to 5 times faster than before COVID hit. And it depends on the market. And you'll see, for example, at one end, the UK, at 4.5 times the rate of digitization into e-commerce. And even in markets like Japan, which typically are much more localized and they support local businesses, there is still significant growth. And that is also very much an aging market. And so we have to sort of think about our businesses and how much are we doing online, and what does that look like, and how much time and resource are we putting into online development so that it makes sure it really works well. I want to talk briefly about education. Again, a lot of you have experienced firsthand as being a parent. You may be in studies yourself, and actually thinking about how many people have been in lockdown and had their education disrupted. So this image here is actually taken on the 15th of April last year. And actually, if you look at the colors here, so the partially open to schools is the bright pink. The closed due to COVID is by far the majority of the world. The fully open you'll see is in just a couple of little dots of the whole world, and then a few on academic break. So at that particular time, there were just over 1.3 billion young people around the world in lockdown. And actually what created from that is a whole lot of workarounds. And so the last year, education has become completely democratized. We've moved away from this idea to physically turn up to university halls and lecture halls across the city. You can now enter into universities globally that you could never access before, the likes of Harvard's and Stanford's, just because they have open enrollment across the world fully online. And so if you take one example of Harvard University being disrupted, all of these little spin-outs from it have taken on just one piece of the Harvard experience, but they're doing it in a very much a responsive, personalized way. So whether it be continuing education or taking on just the admissions piece or the campus life experience, we've got undergrad schools, we've got people doing micro-credentials and degrees online, there's all sorts of certifications, online libraries. Look, if you really think about this approach, it's what's happening across all sectors. We're taking the big organizations who have been sort of at the kind of at the frontier of the business world for a long time, and they are being basically pulled into the smaller pockets by startups and businesses who are basically saying we can do it better, we can respond in a different way. And they start digital, they respond to this newer generation. Between the Gen Zs, who are the most dominant in the world, 2.5 billion, and the millennials, around half the world's population now is under the age of 40. And actually, they are very actively adopting these new ways of thinking. Learning is just one example. And then if you think about, this is just come out of Microsoft last year, about where we sit right now, we have around 41 million people who are really specialized in digitization in the world. The rapid growth here is just incredible. So if we think about just 51 million this year, and then another 149 million jobs in the next 3 years around these key areas of privacy, cybersecurity, data analytics, cloud, and software development. Now, if you start to imagine what that might look like and your business is not already in this space and it's not adopting new ways of working, these companies who are going to come into your sector are going to come in and basically annihilate these old models, because they will be digital first and they will attract young people who want to work in these sectors. So if you're thinking about your business, if it's got a lot of traditional ways of working, if it's hierarchical, if it's non-distributed, if it's analog and paper-based, this is the time you need to be taking to really think about your learning curve and what you can do to change. So how do we identify new insights, and how do we recognize blind spots? And this is the part that I work the most on. So when I work with large organizations across the world, typically large corporates, what we find is there is people within executive and boards are often over-indexed by what they've done before. So they've actually had the information that got them to where they are, the skills and experience. They surround themselves with others like it. So if I use the example of banking, you'll end up with an executive team who are all bankers in different parts. So there might be those who come from IT backgrounds, some will be in people, some will be in procurement or relationships, but in the end, they will all have a banking background. And it means within these silos, you don't get the diversity to get the innovation that happens, and it creates this groupthink. And groupthink is potentially the most dangerous thing you can have in your culture as you're going into this highly digitized world. So let's just talk about a few blind spots. So what we know is companies are very much aware, acutely aware, that COVID is changing things. And so 90%, according to McKinsey & Company research, believe that COVID is fundamentally going to change the way they do business over the next 5 years. So this is not just technology changes, this is fundamentally the whole way they operate. And another 85% are concerned they'll have a lasting impact on their customers' needs and wants, which means they won't be able to respond to their customers in the way that they have or how their customers want to be responded to. And if you think of those numbers as an insight and saying, if that's reality, then actually this is the really critical time to understand what will you be doing fundamentally different and how will you respond to changing customer needs. Another key insight which may surprise people, and this was research that was done recently by Harvard Business Review, is that 9 out of 10 people are willing to earn less to do more meaningful work. And that is something that we don't often talk about. It's very few people who say, I'm prepared to take less money, but actually pull them aside and talk to them about the value of what they do and actually how much they work and the returns they get. 9 out of 10 is a pretty good indicator that we're on the cusp of some significant change, that people aren't prepared to do work that's not relevant or not meaningful for them. I'm just going to do a quick quiz, and because I can't see you, you can basically think about this in your head. But actually, these are some really interesting insights, and this comes from a website called Gapminder in Sweden, who really set out to make sure that people don't have wrong information at their fingertips. So if you take this one here, how many people in the world would live within the range of a 3G or higher quality mobile network? Now, I know that most of you right now will say 40%, and maybe some at 65. Very, very few of you will say 90%, but the answer is 90%. But according to Gapminder, 74% of people get this question wrong. Now, why is this important? The thing is, we imagine that the rest of the world is not as evolved as the Western world. The reality is the developing world is younger, they are more digital, and they are likely to be doing most of their work from smartphones or mobile phones. And actually, they are recreating the way we interact. So they are just as active on the same sort of social media or platforms that we are, have the same ability to digitize, but their motivations are even higher because their access to market is driven by this ability to connect without having physical infrastructure. Here we have another question. In 1990, 58% of the world's population lived in low-income countries. What is the share today? Now, again, you think, well, 1990, it's 31 years ago, and you think, is it more? Could it be around 61%? That more people live in low income? Could it be a little bit less, 37? Or is it possible just 9% of the world's population now live in low-income countries? And of course, that is the right answer, just 9%. But again, 93% of people don't understand that. They don't understand that actually most people are coming out of low income and moving more and more into middle class. And of course, it's been driven by populations in China and India. But that means the market opportunity is not just those that we are thinking about, but much more extensive for those who have come through into middle class and able to be part of the economic market. Just a couple more of these questions. Here's another one. What happened to the total amount of raw materials used across the world annually since 2000? So in the last 21 years, do we use more, less, or about the same raw materials? So these are things that you pull from the earth. It could be things like lithium for batteries and cobalt, or it could be sand, things that we use for construction. So depending on who you are, you might know the answer. Most people guess it's probably not increasing about 70%. But of course it is. And actually another big part of why we've got such challenges around climate. And then lastly, compared to 1980, the cost of energy from a solar panel today, is it roughly 1% of the 1980 cost, 21%, or 41%? Now, you may have noticed a theme here. Most of you will be thinking probably 41% it's reduced in cost, but the answer is, of course, 1%. 79% of people get this wrong, so don't feel bad if you did get it wrong. But again, it shows we think about energy and we think about the cost of solar, we often imagine it from the time we first heard just how expensive solar is. And if we don't understand the changing context, we're making decisions, and particularly if you're an infrastructure or building, that we don't understand how fast things have moved. So what will technology teach us in the next few years, and what will it be able to do? So the first ones I want to think about and share with you are these AI optimized manufacturing. But to be fair, it could be any form of manufacturing, any form of AI optimization across any industry. We also need to be thinking about energy transformation and actually thinking about how do we look at our carbon or no carbon economies and how do we get there fast. If we take the absolute best, at places like Norway, who have really reduced their carbon, they've electrified very quickly. As small nations, we certainly should be thinking about how we can be doing these. I'm not going to go through all of these different technologies, but it's really worth saying that some of these key areas around things like quantum computing, which is the ability for computers to work in quad bits, not just in bits and bytes that we all know right now, means that we can process and basically run really complicated theories through a quantum computer, and they will be able to diagnose or work out the problem very quickly. In fact, so quickly, we're talking about 10,000 times faster. So this is where we see some massive advances in medicine and actually thinking about curing things like cancers. The adoption or the mass adoption of 5G technology means that we'll be able to do things like telesurgery. There'll be no lag in any type of connections. And actually a lot of that will come through 5G and satellite deployment. The blurring of physical and virtual spaces. So we've thought about this a lot already with the way we're working, construction being more synchronized, we're removing CO2, things like machine learning, AI, and then of course, privacy is going to be one of those things that we can't get away from forevermore. How do we look at these same types of changes across the next few years? So this is actually moving out of the fourth industrial revolution and actually thinking about the next 5 years up to 2025 or 4 years. So many of you will be already thinking about these advanced industrial robotics and how we can do smarter tasks using automation and mesh networks, the idea that we can think about decentralized systems and actually things like edge computing, which is bringing computers a little bit closer back into the mainframe, so to speak, and not so much in the cloud, so that where you have computing capacity, it's near where the data is captured. We also be thinking about blockchain and decentralized systems for finance. The Internet of Things, wearables, ingestibles, so there's some big changes happening here, and actually even implantables. So we've got things like some of the nanotech that's happening where you can actually implant and actually become super strong, super bright, super kind of actually that cyber physical world that's coming through. Renewable living is, if you watch where the rich and famous or the super rich and famous spend their money, you can already see some of these things happening. Things like dome living, which I know is already a real thing here in New Zealand, and I'm sure it is in Australia, where people who have the ability to think about the future, they are starting to live in these much more controlled environments to sort of combat and as a sort of an option if the climate gets a little crazy. So again, some of these other areas will be depending on the sector you're in, but one by one, sector by sector, we're all going to be impacted by these changes because of the spill across from one sector to the other, and things like quantum computing. But again, immersive and simulated experiences will take on tourism, it will take on hospitality, health, education, retail. You know, it doesn't really matter which sector you're in. You have to have your horizons and your peripheral vision really open to some of these things that are happening, because they are literally coming at us in the next, probably 1,000 days. So I'm not going to go through this particular list. It's sort of an amalgamation of the last two, but some of the key points to bring through here: the aging population. So the reason our population ages so quickly is that people are living much longer. And so we would have expected 30 years ago that we'd live to be 70, and which is why our pensions typically kick in around 65. You get 5 years of sort of retirement. And now where people are retiring at 65 and potentially living to be 90 or 100, we're actually going to have a lot more people in that older age group. And so we're going to have to think about how do we keep them engaged with learning and earning and actually having them in the community. And so, of course, this will be us in not that distant future. The other thing is the Generation Z, who I mentioned before, coming into the workforce, and some of their expectations about how they want to work, when they want to work, why they want to work. And they are going to be your main source of employees in a very short time. Digital twins are number 7 here. If you're not aware of them, it's supposedly the big technological advancement, the mainstreaming of digital twins in 2021, so this year. And digital twins is basically having a digital clone of your operations. So infrastructure companies, most of them already have these. So that, for example, if you're running a utility company, you'd have a digital version of it so you can see how things impact the system depending on what you're doing. You can turn things off, turn things on in a digital world, and you can actually see that in this sort of manufactured digital twin. But actually even buildings have twins now, when they can think about the operations of buildings and air conditioning and flow and people and egress, for example. So certainly a big part of changes that are happening. So I want to talk to you about this idea of a growth mindset. Now, right now, even though I can't see you, I'm sure a number of you are thinking, this all sounds a little bit scary, that there's so much change happening. What I want to really put forward to you is that almost in every metric in the world right now, whether it be health, education, people moving to the middle class, they're all positive. We have a whole lot less people involved with things like really bad behavior around alcohol and drugs. We have less teenage pregnancies. We have more people in education than ever before, right across all groups. We have more people able to get into housing. The inequality is absolutely growing, but actually across the whole board, things are getting better, and technology is enabling that. And a lot of this tech you will already have adopted. The problem is, as we get older, we very quickly move into this, what we call the below the line thinking. We become closed to the idea of change or the fact that we need to learn again, and we expect the ability for others to learn and for us to benefit from their learning. And if we decide that we're going to be committed to being right based upon what we thought was true or was true at a different time, we very quickly become irrelevant. And actually, from the safety and security of sitting in my house here talking to you and not being able to throw things at me, I know it's hard to hear that. The idea that you might be sitting there going, but I am right. Actually, I think right now it's the one time, if you're a mature adult, we need to be so open to the idea that a lot of what we're about to experience, we just don't know. And we're going to have to be really good at asking questions and learning. And it's going to be one of those things that's going to be a big part of the next 10 years. So before we go into questions soon, I do want to just talk through what are the things that stop us seeing change? And why are so many of us sitting back at the moment going, okay, I just want to go back to normal. What does it look like? You know, when does business as normal happen? When do we feel like we can do the things we did at 12, 18 months ago before COVID? So many of us are just wanting that normalcy to come back and actually thinking about the way our kids learn, thinking about the way that we want to go to work. And some of these reasons are here. So the acronym short, salience, habits, overload, responsibility, and targets. So salience, will start there. What we call is the availability heuristic. And this is the technical term, which is a cognitive bias term, which means we carry so many biases with us. And one of the biases that actually influence us the most is the thing that we see most recently. So right now, whatever you're doing at the moment in your life, whether you might be sitting in a world of health, you might be sitting in a world of education or manufacturing, actually your lens to the world is based around that exposure. And so whatever's happening in your working environments becomes overly in your mind as being the most important. And you don't see the cognitive biases that you have, which means you imagine things that are highly similar to what you experience and not actually outside of that world or the most recent events. The things you see right now, today, and you're experiencing, you imagine more people are experiencing that as well. Habits, we know, we all have these. But actually, the thing is, one of the habits we've got into, which is particularly dangerous, is this doom scrolling. And no matter what you know about technology, you probably know that actually algorithms will tell you what you see. You have very little say unless you're very clever and you start using things like incognito mode on your searching. Most of what you see will reinforce your views. And so this is where it gets into all sorts of complicated areas where people who become into groupthink and decide a particular situation to be true, or they have a particular really strong focus on a belief, it gets reinforced time and time again. What the danger of this means is that we don't see the full expanse of the views and the full expanse of the actual implications of having a narrow view or a dated view of something. And so what we need to do is very actively look and surround ourselves by people who are much more informed across a range of areas and actually rely a lot less on particularly social media, which has a very much a skew built into it. And I know it's very easy to kind of fall into that trap of wanting to kind of just scroll through your phone and get information served to you, but just be really mindful that what you see is only there to reinforce your interest, your shopping style, your stage of life, your neighborhood, your job, your pay income, your number of kids, you know, what stage you're at in your life. And so none of it is like going in the good old days to the library and picking a book off the shelf and just finding a good book. And three other areas here, the overload. So technology's pace is accelerating, as we've talked. We've really seen this quickening of life and work, and actually our brains are overloaded. And the more our brains are overloaded, the more we have the inability to get the actual sort of the scope to see what's coming. And so we actually put up some pretty big barriers. And so I'm very much the believer of people saying, don't push against closed doors, because actually these world that we're going into is changing. We're having to respond to very quickly and having to learn and jump online and solve problems. Actually, there are going to be people who push against you, and actually because they don't have the information and they don't know what they don't know. And so what we need to do is jump on to this escalator or this, this rocket ship, and actually get comfortable that the first jump on is going to be tough. And once we're on it, it actually suddenly will be really exciting. It has this ability to sort of amplify your opportunities. It gives you the ability for your grey matter in your head to kind of be stimulated, to work that muscle that is often forgotten about as we get older. And actually this idea that we need to jump onto this ride of change. The responsibility of the modern world, we do often detach, and we think about things as being a little bit anonymous, and we see this particularly on online trolling. And that's really a symptom of people being able to comment and say very bad things with being totally anonymous. And actually it's a little bit of that comes to our life that we sort of go, well, someone else will do it. And so we don't need the responsibility. The IT team will do it. My staff know that, or my young cousin, he's good at that, or my son, he will help me out. Actually, the responsibility in these 70, 80, 100 years that we have, it is really important that we have the ability to know this stuff ourselves. And I'm always amazed wherever there is the ability to learn, and you talk to mature adults, the majority of people, when they think about learning, would rather prioritize a purchase of maybe a new car. Perhaps they want to upgrade their outdoor furniture. But the reality is the only thing that improves your chances of getting a great job in the future and improving your life is actually the ability to know new things. And so it's the single best investment you could possibly make in yourself is to go out and add one more thing to your CV, which contemporizes what you do. You might have done a machine learning course. You might have just delved into what it is to be involved with the Internet of Things. You may just do a psychology paper that looks at modern psychology or sociology. It's so important to show that you're learning. And then finally here, targets. A lot of people will say that what you put targets and what you measure, you'll be successful in, and you prioritize. There is actually the flip side of that is actually, if you have targets, you focus on short-term opportunities and short-term investments and short-term goals and gains. But actually, if you look at the most successful companies, they have the absolute opposite strategy. They take this idea of things like investment or change and impact and put it over a longer period of time. And it's particularly strong in our Indigenous communities where they take a view that may be 50 or 100 years. But by doing that, we do better for the environment, we do better for future generations, we do better investment on ourselves. And actually, so long-term thinking at a time of rapid change actually is the best way to navigate through this. It's about making sure that we are doing things at a reasonable speed to keep in touch and keep on top of things, but actually with a long-term vision. And thinking that way, it's going to be a really strong way of navigating these changes. And so I'm just going to leave it here before I go back and join the group, just to say, this is a group of students that we're taking. If you look across this group here of, people of a later stage in life, for many of them, and they're still there with their computers thinking about learning and upskilling. And I always say when I'm in a group like this, incredibly empowering it is when you get people who are sort of saying, actually, you know what? I want to be part of this world. I want to be really engaged and be learning and be open to change and think absolutely above the line. So back into the room. I apologize for the speed of which that was delivered, but we have a very tight window here. And I'm hoping that there's some good questions to come through. Now, Mark, are you able to hear me?
I can indeed. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I can see there's a few people typing now with some questions. So there's been no questions that have come through during the presentation. It's great, by the way. I'd never heard of the word digital twins. That whole life concept I'd never actually encountered before as well. So
Yeah, and look, I think it's really interesting with digital twins because it has become very mainstream in large organisations. And I think it's one of the challenges we have as a country, or countries like Australia and New Zealand, is we are not as engaged in learning. We're in OECD, we're at the bottom end of active learners. We also have a higher reliance on small businesses, and small businesses often don't put the investment into technology in the same way big businesses do. And so it probably more so in New Zealand than in Australia. But actually, if you look at really big markets where competition is strong and you've got large population groups, in hundreds of millions, then actually things like digital twins are the only way. You try to imagine running roads without a digital twin road system, or construction companies, etc. So very important, big step in advancement there.
We've got a question here. What would be the 3 things today to start having this growth mindset? What are 3 advice points?
Yeah, okay. So I think the very first one is acknowledging where you've become a little stale, and actually where you are relying on sort of previous experience or understanding of things. So if you ever catch yourself suddenly talking about something from 20 years ago in a business decision, you're probably a little stale. And so when you're thinking about planning, particularly if you do annual planning, I would always recommend you start with a blank piece of paper. And this includes for your life, not just, this could be a personal plan or a business plan, not just take out the one from last year and sort of do a tick and cross exercise and then say, we're going to make some more money and reduce our costs. Actually think about what the business needs. And again, in a business context, go to the customers that perhaps you haven't seen as much from lately, or customers you've lost, and really understand why you've lost them. What was it that you've done or didn't do, and who have they gone to by comparison? And what I've found through just feedback from the companies we work with, often they find that someone has gone to a much more responsive business that actually has more digitization and more ability to respond instead of real-time 24 hours and less reliant on old systems. So I think it is, take a leap. If you're nervous about learning again and feeling a little bit overwhelmed by it, start with something small. Start with a pottery class. Start with just doing, or maybe just going into a night class and doing something that you're interested in, just to get the kind of your brain thinking about things again. The one thing about learning is amazing is your endorphins kick in. As soon as you learn, your brain starts to spark. It's why you love conferences. At the end of a conference, our brains are like, they're all having a good old time. And actually then a few days later, we're back to normal. If you're learning regularly, you get that endorphin kick constantly, and your neurons fire up, a little bit like going to the gym and feeling good about getting some exercise.
Excellent. And Robert here says, is there any relevant courses? He says, as a middle manager, what recommended courses do you think would be relevant?
So I tell you what's really great. COVID has basically taken away all costs associated with learning, and actually has put almost every possible type of program online. So there is a whole area, what we call MOOCs. It's an acronym for Massive Online Open Courses. So some of the big ones, FutureLearn, which has got a real leaning towards Australia. We've got Coursera, Udacity, Udemy, even LinkedIn Learning. There's some really great stuff. If you go there, just type in the area that you're interested in, and you'll suddenly see there'll be short courses, there'll be micro credentials, there'll be degree courses, there'll be postgrad. It's almost everything is available now. And the great thing is, most of it doesn't mean you have to go physically into a classroom. You'll be in virtual classrooms, live tutoring. So it feels a bit like you're in a classroom like this, but actually the reality is you're sitting at the comfort at home with a beer in your hand.
And Julia says distributed workforce is a great thing. She moved from Australia to New Zealand, lives in a small town in New Zealand, thinks it's fabulous. And then I have Carmelina, who says that as we keep developing and changing, is there a way to tap into good models of analysis and thinking to be able to digest the volume of knowledge we're facing today?
I think it's like anything. You start small and start finding good source of information. So, if you are addicted to social media, and let's face it, a lot of us are. For example, I use Twitter to get feeds from really reputable. So everything from scientific publications and space things like NASA and Natural Geographic, but also the New York Times and various. So actually my feeds are only filled with information that is really interesting, but also reliable. And then I use that to look at things that really interest me further, and I delve deeper into it. I think it is, there is so much information out there. I mean, it's where to start. So find a few interesting channels that you really enjoy and stick with them. MIT do some really good things in terms of publications. But even if you like reading magazines, subscribe to some interesting things like the New Yorker magazine, or equivalents where you've actually got some, The Economist, or things that actually will provoke thinking and great conversations around the dinner table. Get away from those sort of the normal Barbie talk.
Yes, indeed. Kirsty says, what sort of class should she go for? Sort of inside her field or outside of it?
Look, I think it really doesn't matter. I think the beginning stages, do things that really interest you to get you back in the learning journey. Like I say, do a pottery class or an art class if that's what you haven't done for a long time. It is your brain is a muscle. It does need to work, and if it hasn't worked for a while, and you delve into something really complicated, what you're going to find is going to be pretty intimidating, and also you're more likely to drop out. So stick with something first, probably face to face if you could do it first time round. Build a bit of a network, build the encouragement of others just like you are doing the same thing, and then you'll get more confident about doing some of this online learning, which may be a little less comfortable because of the forum or because the topic may be a little more of a stretch.
RM says, what's the biggest roadblock then to developing this mindset?
I think we all doubt ourselves. There is a huge doubt about our capability, and because we look around and we don't see our friends learning again, it's sort of one of the things. I run a graduate school, and so the Mind Lab and Tech Futures Lab here in Auckland, and average age of our students are in their 40s. And one of the things that everyone says, they come in first day and go, wow, there's so many people here my age learning. And they say, but when they look at their friends and across their networks, they don't see that. And so there is this little bit of thing of like, if I'm wanting to learn, why is it no one else is learning? The reality is probably more people than you think are learning, but also a lot of people have fallen into this trap of thinking, I can learn it on the job, or I'll get it in the next job. I tell you a really great thing I actually often do is when I'm working with large groups, I say, okay, so if you lost your job tomorrow and your job came up in your own company, the one you're at right now. So say, for example, you're in a telco, your job came up tomorrow, would it say the same thing in the job ad? Everybody agrees it would look quite different. And would you have the skills to apply for it? And actually, a lot of people realize they've got some pretty big gaps in their knowledge, that they actually know that they're already plugging, kind of covering smoke and mirrors on the job, or they've seen other people be promoted above them, and they recognize why that is. Is the kind of the hurt and the disappointment of losing the job, but actually in their hearts, they know there's bits of information or key kind of knowledge they don't have, and they haven't yet committed to learning.
Now, I'm conscious of time, so we've got Annie here. She says that many people in my business are reluctant to change because we've always done it or always doing it that way. So as a junior employee, how do I best approach a conversation and encourage a growth mindset for somebody who's not in my generation?
Yeah, look, I think it's such an important question. I get asked this a lot. If you're an organization who hasn't understood the value of bringing young people into the conversation and have not trialing new systems and being more kind of a flatter structures and more collaborative tools and maybe sharing Google Docs and just on that journey, I would say there's a point, if you can't find people like you in the organization, actually you probably think about changing organizations. And I mean that because there is an element of learning on the job. And so if you're an organization that's not a learning organization and you're not actively learning at the same time outside, then you're it's like a double whammy. You need to be in a place where your opinion is valued. And I think this comes back to a lot of my earlier part of my presentation about a generation. And I'm going to assume you're probably a millennial, and your expectations that work value you, your contribution, and you have flexibility is a fair and absolutely reasonable request in today's world. And so there are some of these organizations who are missing that massive change. And in the end, they'll be the losers. So I think it's, try hard first, find like-minded people like you, but don't stay if you can't find anyone who's prepared to understand the world is shifting.
Fantastic. All right. So we're 55 minutes in. I think that brings us to the end of the presentation today. And I just wanted to thank you. Howard's described. Thank you, Francis. That was great. I will jump.
Thanks, Howard. Appreciate that.
I'll jump on that and say thank you again. I think it was fascinating what we heard from you today. So thank you, Francis, and thank you everybody for joining us in the leadership series with People to People and Frog Recruitment in New Zealand. We'll be doing our next webinar in, I think it's June/July. So keep an eye out for the email there and join us for the next in the series. But thanks again, Francis. It's been fabulous.
Thank you very much. Ka kite anō for those in Aotearoa.
Thank you. Ta.